Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the final session of Ethics for UBC, where we focus on ethics in environment and democracy. I'm Viorica Hurinku, and I will be your moderator today. I'm a PhD student at Neuroethics Canada in the Experimental Medicine program. I would first like to thank the President's Office for supporting this important initiative and members of the organizing committee as well, Dr. Judith Hall, Dr. Judy Illis, Dr. Paul Van Donkelaar, Louise Harding, Marianne Bacani, and Anna Nectarline. I also want to let you know that this session will be recorded. In a moment, I will hand the mic to Dr. Leslie Cormack to introduce the session. So Dr. Leslie Cormack is the Principal and Deputy Vice Chancellor of UBC's Okanagan campus in Kelowna, BC. Dr. Cormack joined UBC in July 2020 from the University of Alberta, where she served as Dean of the Faculty of Arts from 2010 to 2020. An historian of early modern science, Dr. Cormack specializes in geography and mathematics of 16th century England and holds an academic appointment as a professor of history at UBC Okanagan. Dr. Cormack, over to you.
Thank you so much. It is a real delight to be here today. I really do want to welcome and thank everyone for joining us in this panel discussion on ethics in environment and democracy. As you heard, my name is Leslie Cormack, and I do have the privilege of being the Principal and Deputy Vice Chancellor of UBC's beautiful Okanagan campus. I want to begin by acknowledging that UBC's campuses are situated on the traditional territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation and their peoples. It is so important to remember this as we contemplate the work that we do every day in reconciliation or not in reconciliation, and hope that we are walking a path together to a better place. And as many of you, as our audience members, may be joining from various places near and far, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of all of those lands. Ethics in Environment and Democracy is the final installation of Ethics for UBC, a 5-part series of panel discussions to explore and strengthen ethics scholarship and education across our Vancouver and Okanagan campuses. These discussions are for you, our audiences of students, faculty, researchers, alumni, to learn about the current landscape of ethics at our university and opportunities to become more involved. Today, our exceptional panelists will share their insights and experiences with ethics across a variety of disciplines, from animal welfare and ecophysiology to democracy and ecofeminism. I'm now going to pass it back to our moderator, Viorica Hurinku, to introduce our panelists and kickstart the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Cormack. So as an overview, this session will begin with 40 minutes of roundtable discussion amongst the panelists. Afterwards, we will have 10 minutes of general Q&A from our audience members, all of you, and then our panelists will be given a final prompt before the discussion concludes at 5 o'clock. If you have further questions and would like to continue the conversation in a small group setting, you're invited to join a behind the scenes breakout room with a panelist from 5 o'clock to 5:15, and you're welcome to bring additional questions during this time. So I'm now going to introduce our distinguished panelists. So Dr. Max Cameron teaches political science and public policy and global affairs at UBC. He specializes in comparative politics and theories of constitutional democracy. He wrote Political Institutions and Practical Wisdom with Oxford University Press. Dr. Cameron co-founded the Institute for Future Legislatures. In 2020, he was named Distinguished Fellow by the Canadian Association of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And this year, the Latin American Studies Association awarded him with the Guillermo O'Donnell Prize and Lectureship for his work on democracy. Welcome today, Dr. Cameron. Dr. Danielle Ignace is an Indigenous ecophysiologist studying the impacts of global change on ecosystem health and communities of color. She is an enrolled member of the Coeur d'Alene tribe. Dr. Ignace is an assistant professor in forest and conservation sciences, a research associate at Harvard Forest, associate editor of the journal Elemental Science of the Anthropocene, and is a Science for Social Equity Fellow funded by Faircount. She is passionate about science communication, developing Indigenous curriculum, and finding community-driven solutions to environmental justice. Welcome, Dr. Ignace. Next, we have Dr. Astrida Neymanus. She's a feminist cultural theorist. Her research focuses on human-water relationships and climate catastrophe as a symptom of corrupted social and cultural relations. She is currently Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Feminist Environmental Humanities at UBC Okanagan on the unceded lands of the Syilx Okanagan people. Her most recent book is Bodies of Water, Post-Human Feminist Phenomenology. Welcome, Dr. Neyman. And finally, we have Dr. Dan Weary. He is a UBC professor who co-founded the university's animal welfare program within the Faculty of Land and Food Systems and co-directs this active research group. His research focuses on understanding what is important to animals cared for by humans and how we can improve the lives of these animals and their caregivers. Dan is an NSERC Industrial Research Chair, an honor he has held for the past 25 years. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Weary. So panelists, you're going to be presented with three guiding questions for our discussion today. So to allow enough time for each person to speak, if you can, I'll ask you to please limit your answers each to about 90 seconds for each question. Thank you so much. So I'm going to begin by asking you to tell us, and this is a bit of a three-parter. So if you can, tell us about first your area of interest and about the others who share it at UBC Vancouver and UBC Okanagan, and also opportunities for students to be involved. So I'm going to start with Dr. Max Cameron.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's really lovely to have the opportunity to be with you. So this is, in 90 seconds, you want a summary of all of that?
If it's possible.
Okay.
But there's buffer built in, I'm sure, so.
Okay, well, so my work focuses on the idea of practical wisdom, which goes back to Aristotle, and it's about how we know how to do the right thing in a particular circumstance and to do it in the right way and at the right time and for the right reason. And so over the last little while, I've been involved in thinking about how we might cultivate practical wisdom, in particular among politicians or aspiring politicians. And so about 10 years ago, colleagues of mine in the Department of Political Science and later the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs created what we call the Institute for Future Legislators, which is a training program for aspiring politicians. And the idea is to give them an opportunity to learn through practice, through experience, and through experimentation, how to be a good politician. And we've really been inspired in doing this by the work of a colleague in the UBC Okanagan campus, Cheryl Holmes, who developed a way of encouraging reflection in practice among students who are studying medicine, which is a sort of a four-part program, a series of reflective discussions that happen throughout their third-year clerkship studies, in which they're encouraged to be primed to observe elements of practice that might be part of the hidden curriculum, to notice things when they occur that they've been primed to think about, to deliberate about them with others, and ultimately at the end of the year to decide the kind of reflective practitioner that they want to be. And we adapted this into our program with quite remarkable results. What we really discovered was encouraging reflection in practice in the process of training people for politics did an enormous amount to encourage people to become more collaborative, to work together, to work in teams, and tone down some of the partisanship and the adversarial conflictualness that often occurred in our simulations. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Cameron. Oh, just so you know, there is some wiggle room. So we just want to make sure we leave some topics for discussion afterwards as well. Thank you so much. Next, I'm going to invite Dr. Danielle Ignace. Tell us about your interest of others who shared at UBC Vancouver and UBC Okanagan and opportunities for students to be involved.
Yeah, thank you. This does seem tough, but it feels like a test here if you can do this in 90 seconds. Right, so I study the impacts of global change on ecosystem health, as well as communities of color, especially Indigenous communities. And what do I mean by global change? Everything from climate change, the climate emergency, nature emergency, impacts of invasive species, and of course, the wildfires that we tend to see over in BC. And so that's a new area of research for me, having just moved to UBC Vancouver within the past year. And so not only am I looking at impacts on ecosystem health, biodiversity, in particular forest health, and what these impacts mean for the ability of these ecosystems to not only stay healthy, but in a sense, being healthy means how much carbon can they store, how much, and in a way, how much can these ecosystems help to mitigate and deal with climate change, as well as rising CO2 levels and global warming. And of course, communities of color and Indigenous communities are really impacted by these global changes as well. And so part of my work also involves the community engagement factor. And so are we actually engaging the community in and trying to answer these questions, understand the impacts, as well as trying to find solutions? And let's see, others at UBC that could be interested. I think everyone could be interested in the impacts of global change, especially climate change, the climate emergency, nature emergency on any ecosystem and all communities locally and globally. And how can students get involved? Well, I think everyone has an opportunity here to bring their whole selves to this. I definitely advocate for that, being an Indigenous woman in STEM and not feeling like I could do that earlier in my career, but feeling like I can do that now. And so I really encourage everyone, all different career stages, to bring their whole selves to the work that we are trying to do with regards to climate change and global change. And that includes everything from community engagement, social sciences, humanities, art. We just need so many different unique ways to not only be interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And next, I'm going to ask Dr. Niminus about your area of interest, about others who shared at UBC Vancouver and Okanagan, and opportunities for students to be involved.
Thanks so much. And I think, Danielle, you set me up perfectly there. So I'm, as was already introduced, as a Canada Research Chair in Feminist Environmental Humanities. And interestingly, I'm cross-appointed across not only 2 departments, but 2 faculties. I work in the English and Cultural Studies Department of the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies at UBCO, as well as in the Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies program of the Community, Culture and Global Studies Department of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So I pretty much have all the bases covered in the arts and social sciences and humanities. So I'm a very interdisciplinary scholar. I research environmental questions from arts and humanities perspectives with a particular interest in gender, feminist, and social justice. Practically, this means that I use humanities and arts-based methods to develop new concepts or tactics for figuring out how to live together well in a time of climate catastrophe. And this includes researching the ways that climate change is not separate from but actually fueled by other systems of power and oppression, such as white supremacy and colonialism and patriarchy. This includes also collaborating with artists and poets and other kinds of storytellers to show how climate change is not only a scientific problem, but that living with it requires grappling with things like feelings and grief and beauty and power and pleasure and joy and knowledge, all of the things that arts and humanities are particularly good at thinking about. And so at UBCO, I have colleagues such as Greg Gerard here in English and Cultural Studies, who is also interested in environmental humanities and narratives of climate change. But I also want to shout out my colleagues in gender studies and Indigenous studies in my other department, as well as over in Vancouver in the Gender, Race, and Social Justice Institute, who are all also doing similar work to look at the interconnections between environment and climate change and the gendered, racialized, and colonial injustices which they are inseparable from. And if you want to, get involved or find out more, of course, you can check out our work at the Field Lab. That's FEELED, so field as in feelings. Thefieldlab.ca is where my research lab sits. We also have a newsletter and Instagram, and we are very collaborative and actually have collaborations with people across UBCO, the community here, and in Vancouver as well.
Thank you, Dr. Neyman. I do love a good play on words, so I appreciate that. And finally, I would like to ask this question to Dr. Dan Weary. Tell us about your area of interest, others who share it at UBC, and opportunities for students to be involved.
Thanks, Virika. What a pleasure to be part of this panel and here today. Yeah, so I'm basically trained as a biologist interested in animal behavior, and I became interested in this sort of broad question of how do we provide a good life to the animals that are under human care. And I've come to realize that in order to do that, we also need to ask the parallel question of how do we also provide a good life for the people who are caring for those animals. The area of animal welfare is ethically contentious. It involves asking questions like, should we be using animals? Should we be using animals for certain purposes, like, let's say, entertainment or research? Should we be using certain types of animals, like, for example, primates or great apes? Should we be subjecting animals to certain types of harms? And those answering those types of questions, it involves partly the biological research that I was originally trained to, which can be particularly helpful in trying to identify ways of mitigating harms, but also involves actually trying to understand the perspectives of the diverse members of society that make decisions about how and when animals are used. And so we've more and more begun studying these sort of human dimensions, shall we say, of animal welfare. I'm lucky to be part of a large research group. I moved here 25 years ago to co-found this animal welfare program. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. We're very proud of that. My main colleagues in the animal welfare program are Dr. David Fraser and Dr. Marina Van Kazalink and Dr. Sasha Protopopova, wonderful colleagues and privileged to be able to work with them. Also very privileged to have worked right from the very beginning with our wonderful Center for Applied Ethics, including David Silver, who I see is on the call today, but also Susan Cox, Michael McDonald, of course, worked with for many years, Michael Burgess, University at UBCO. So yeah, wonderful colleagues. Privileged to have a very large and diverse research group based out of the Macmillan Building in here on the UBC Vancouver campus, with about 40 different researchers of all stages, and we really welcome undergraduates and graduate students and postdocs and people at all different stages. We have this wonderful sort of lunchtime discussions around a big conference table, and people self-identify, I think, eventually as part of the animal welfare program, which is wonderful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weary. And I'm picking up some kind of a common thread between all of your backgrounds here. I hear the idea of goodness from Dr. Weary, living well from Dr. Neyman, bringing all of yourself from Dr. Ignace, and this Aristotelian virtue ethics approach from Dr. Cameron. So this idea of goodness, bringing all of yourself practice, it all kind of comes together and overlaps. And I can already see that we're going to have a great discussion up ahead. So for our second question, what are the cutting edge ethical issues in your area of interest? Or alternatively, you can provide us with an example of a specific ethical dilemma that you have encountered, and you can speak to how you addressed it. I'm going to steal Roland's method from when he moderated, which is I'm going to go down -1 and start with Dr. Niminus to answer this question first.
Oh, I wasn't ready, but I'm ready now. Okay. Thinking about this, I think it's important that I first explain how I understand ethics in my own work, because it's a pretty slippery word. I was trained as a phenomenologist, so a branch of philosophy that's interested in how things actually appear to us in our lived worlds and in our lived experience. So I'm less interested in ethics as something that can be like a category or defined in an abstract way. I want to know how we face it and deal with it in our everyday worlds. So I have a sort of shorthand for explaining what I mean when I say ethics, which is that ethics is what we are called to do when we're faced with violence or suffering or pain in the world or that others are facing. But doing ethics is actually impossible. Like, there will never be a perfect or adequate response to ethical dilemmas because they're dilemmas. And so ethics is impossible. It's what we strive towards. It's what sort of pulls us to respond, and something that will probably never be adequate to, And politics is what we do. Politics is the choices we make. It's when we take actions in response to this impossible call of ethics. And I think that's important because it kind of explains how ethics comes into play in my work. Of course, climate change is a supremely ethical question, right? It places impossible demands on us and asks us for impossible responses. And the work in the environmental humanities, particularly the kind that I do then, is about probing this thinnest, most ephemeral of spaces that exists between what we know we can do and what else might be imaginable, right? This kind of pulling beyond what we already know we can do. It's about probing and imagining what other kinds of worlds are possible. And some of those worlds, of course, are already in existence all around us. So a cutting edge, if we want to call it that, area in my research, if by cutting edge we mean radical, I think is actually addressing climate change by not addressing climate change at all, and instead uplifting and supporting other kinds of work, like feminist work against patriarchal violence, or workers' fights against capitalist theft, indigenous fights for land back, queer and trans demands to thrive in our societies. All of these communities hold knowledge, so much great knowledge, as we know, about violence and survival and extinction, which are exactly the kinds of knowledges that we need in facing climate catastrophe. So in that sense, like, the ethical work for me and the way I see it is actually how to sort of do this bait and switch, like, we want to be addressing climate change and environmental problems, but that means we actually have to bring in these other conversations as actually providing the tools, tactics, and knowledges that we need. I know I don't have much time, so maybe I'll just give a quick example. So a couple of weeks ago at the Field Lab, we hosted an event, ostensibly environmental symposium on fire and watershed health in the Okanagan. And we invited a bunch of scholars, but in fact, we invited them to tell stories, recite poems, learn about the place they were in through sketchbooking methodologies led by silk artists. And instead of sort of repeating knowledge that we already know about fires and watersheds, we tried to generate new knowledge out of these places of conversation, being in place together on the land, telling stories, using arts-based methods, and pulling a lot of people a little bit out of their comfort zone. But in doing that, seeing what other ideas and tactics might be possible when we want to look at a question like climate change here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think at first it's counterintuitive, right? You want to solve an issue and you think you need to go directly at it, but sometimes the best approach is through some other peripheral means that are just as important. Thank you so much. So next I have Dr. Dan Weary. So either name some cutting edge ethical issues in your area of interest, or provide us an example of a specific ethical dilemma that you encountered and how you addressed it.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I don't know if it qualifies as cutting edge, but these are I've got some issues which I guess I'm struggling with anyways, and I hope people will find interesting or sympathize with my struggle somehow anyways. One of which is that often we have this idea in academia and science that we strive to be impartial, to be without biases, etc. Almost all my work is fully embedded. So when I work on the welfare of dairy cows, I do it from the perspective of essentially somebody who is also a dairy farmer. UBC has a dairy farm, and I'm, for better or worse, responsible somehow for the care and of those animals, and have to accept that burden along with every other farmer, and that makes it makes a really interesting sort of landscape to work within. I could say the same thing for the work I do with research animals, is that I'm also an animal researcher. And so when I struggle to improve the lives of research animals, I do it from the perspective of somebody who's embedded in the system. I think that's important because one of the things I'm really interested in is ultimately changing practice. And I think to do that, need to be able to work within a position of trust and mutual respect with the stakeholders that ultimately who we think might someday be interested in the research that we generate. And so yeah, that's sort of the context that I come from. As I mentioned in my sort of preliminary comments earlier, I'm really mostly a biologist, and in that way, this is sort of the low-hanging ethical fruit, if you will. I work at what we call in the animal welfare world primarily around refinements, making the lives of animals a little bit better. You think about that from an ethical perspective. If we're worried about sort of essentially, is it worth it to cause this harm for this type of benefit to humans? Obviously, the more we can minimize the harms, that's got to be better. But it's not that from an ethical perspective, that's trivial. From a biological perspective, it's super hard, and it's a lifetime of work there, of course, and it's where the majority of our work happens. I would say on the ethical side, though, one of the things that's really interesting is a lot of the ethical issues, in fact, as I just hinted at earlier, often framed from a utilitarian perspective. We often see in the rhetoric, especially for people defending the status quo, they'll say, we have to keep the sows in gestation crates, or otherwise, bacon would be too expensive for poor people to buy, or we have to expose these rats to this procedure, or otherwise we won't be able to develop this cure for cancer. One of the interesting things that we found is that actually real world participants often are troubled by that type of utilitarian box we put around them. I see Max shaking, nodding his head here. So we're really interested in trying to change the conversations around there in terms of looking at the types of other kinds of ethical structures that people apply to these kinds of issues, and how that changes the outcome of their thinking. And that, of course, involves lots of research around trying to better understand the views of especially the people that are using the animals and making decisions about how to use animals, and engaging with them in a variety of ways to better understand sort of the world that they come from, and how we could find ways of achieving changes that are meaningful for the animals, but are still workable from their perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Worby. That is interesting, because you talk about the perspectives of the farmers and including all these interested parties, but you also have an interested party that can't really speak for themselves, which is the cows, right? That's something to think about as we move into discussion for later on.
Yeah, no, the bringing in the perspective of the variety of voices. I mean, it's something that actually we were talking about in our preliminary comments even before we started the session, is that how do we actually provide a voice to the animals themselves and really listen to that voice, in addition to the voices of the other stakeholders that are affecting the lives of these animals. Really a terribly difficult but important issue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So next, I'm going to turn the question over to Dr. Max Cameron.
Well, thank you. And I'm very much in agreement with everything that I've heard today. For me, when I think about ethical dilemmas, I like to start with something very practical, like imagine you have a friend and your friend is thinking about doing something you don't think is wise. For example, they might want to have a closer relationship with somebody who you really think is untrustworthy. What's the appropriate thing to do? Should you warn your friend against this person that you don't like and risk the friendship, maybe alienate your friend, maybe even lose the friendship? Or do you support them? Do you say, yeah, you get something out of that relationship, you should pursue it, and not be fully honest, right? So a situation like that asks us to try to balance different kinds of goods. One is honesty, and another is trying to be supportive. And sometimes those things are in tension. And that's why I find utilitarianism so problematic. Now, because you can't, there's not going to be a cost-benefit analysis that will answer that question, just as there's no rule that you can turn to that will tell you what the right response is. Really, you're never going to know how to deal with a situation like that unless you know a lot about the people concerned. It depends a lot on your relationship with them, what you know about them, the context, how much trust you have in them, and so forth, right? And so to deal with situations like that well, you need experience, you need knowledge, you need practice. And the better you know people, the closer friends you become, the easier it becomes to do that often. And my argument is that politics is very much the same thing. Politicians are always in a position of having to balance their own conscience, what their party wants, what their constituents want, what the causes that they're attached to. If you think about Dr. Bonnie Henry and the way she's had to balance public health issues, public opinion and its reaction to a variety of public health orders, to economic issues, schools, dealing with people who have underlying conditions and so forth, right? These are very difficult balances, and we often don't get them right. But our belief is that we can learn to do better through practice and through experience. And so that's why we've created this program. But a real ethical dilemma that we sometimes encounter is because our program is open to anyone, it's cross-partisan, it's open to people from all political parties or all parts of the political spectrum. We often get people who are very strongly in disagreement. For example, a few years ago, we had participants who were activists in favor of SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, curriculum changes in the schools, activists who were in favor of that and activists who were against it, and they could barely sit together in the same room. And it presented for us a real dilemma, which was, we don't really ever know as teachers what people are learning from what we're offering them. We can create a context for learning, but people are going to learn different things depending on their dispositions, depending on what their aims are. And are we comfortable, for example, with possibly training people to be better politicians who have views we find abhorrent? So that's been a real dilemma for us, because part of what we really believe is that it is good for people to get better at the practice, regardless of what their political orientation may be, whether we agree or disagree with it. And so you might want to think to yourself, think about people whose views you disagree with. Would you wish them to be better politicians advancing their cause or not? And it might be tempting to say, well, we'd like people who we don't agree with not to be good at what they do. But then you think about what's happened, for example, with the Republican Party in the United States, and you look at the consequences of bad politics on the part of people whose views you may disagree with. So that's been for us, I think, one of the biggest struggles we've had. But our basic commitment is to the idea that if you create the right kind of context, one of the things that happens is that people do find common ground. And at the end of our program, the anti-SOGI and pro-SOGI activists wound up being able to sit together and even go out and have a meal together and to talk. And I think that there's something about democratic politics. There's something about putting people in a situation where they have to deliberate together and reach decisions leading to action that actually creates the possibility of finding common ground. And that really is what's amazing about democracy if it's practiced well.
Thank you, Dr. Cameron. I think you've left us on a very hopeful note. So I really want to hold on to that feeling that we can find common ground. And next, I will pose this question to Dr. Danielle Ignace. Cutting-edge ethical issues in your area of interest, or an example of a specific ethical dilemma you've encountered.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the term cutting edge is an interesting term. It's more like, for me, I think still history repeating itself in a modern day problem based on the past, and just a few examples which will be of no surprise to anyone are issues of extraction of knowledge, right? Or trying to extract indigenous knowledge or ways of knowing in order to meet some other goal that has no bearing on the original intent of that knowledge or ways of relating to the land. Extraction of resources. It's such a huge issue that we see all the time in the news here in BC, and even thinking about old growth forests, right? Somehow it's become a modern day controversial topic in an interesting way. And not only for the Indigenous communities, but also for ecosystem health and climate change. So that's a very complex problem there. And also extraction of resources, culturally important resources, data, samples, the list can kind of go on and on. There are many examples of extraction of these types of things, whether it's knowledge samples or important resources. Some other ways, issues that we're still dealing with in repeating history, issues of exclusion. It does tie back in relation to some of the issues of extraction, but in a sense, what we're seeing now is a little bit of a heightened interest in Indigenous knowledge, these ways of knowing, and yet it's almost at a pace where we're starting to see non-Indigenous community members speaking on behalf of Indigenous communities or communities of color without real, collaboration, co-partnering, without consent or consultation. So I guess those are two big topics, right, that we're still dealing with today. There are others as well that we could probably delve into, but for the interest of time, those are a couple of the really big ones. And how to kind of resolve this. There's, I get this question often of, okay, well, what can we do to work with Indigenous communities? If I want to work with Indigenous communities, how do I go about this? And I always say that it's not probably a satisfying answer, because it's not going to be a one size fits all. There's no general one template that will work for every community. And it's something, that Max Cameron was just saying, and I was hearing how we're all overlapping in some of our ideas, but learning about the community, right? Are you actually learning as much as you can about people in the community? And in this case, it is about relationship building. It's about asking questions, listening, really trying to understand that community. And when we build those relationships, then that can really transform in the solutions to some of these issues. So, in a sense, does that mean developing a code of ethics? I think a code of ethics is important in this case, or it can be a set of principles. And of course, again, this is very nuanced depending on who you're interacting with. And the other, I think, unsatisfying answer or aspect to that solution, which is relationship building, which is that academics or academia has a different pace, right, than relationship building. And so if we have an initiative that gets started and there's funding available, and it would be a strong aspect of a proposal to have the engagement of these communities, well, gosh, you kind of have already needed to started that engagement, right, and building those relationships before considering putting in a grant or trying to apply for funding. And that's just one example, and so that's patience, right? So you need a little bit of patience and asking these questions, listening, learning about the community, really building that relationship. But when it does happen, and in some of my work in the different communities I work with, when it does happen, and you even embrace if you have a mistake made, and you are open and honest about it and transparent about your intentions and your thoughts and where you see the work going, I think that's really transformative. And it just at some point really will just kind of be organic. And if if the good intentions are there, and really owning mistakes if they're made, and that strong communication, I think can really go a long way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ignace. Before we move on, so Dr. Ignace, you're actually going to be the first person I ask the next question to, but you've kind of already answered it. But I'm gonna ask you anyway, because I would love to hear more about how we could facilitate better, more ethical practices in your area of interest. So yes, so speakers think about that, and I'll start with Dr. Ignace. You've already talked about being process-oriented in this sense, getting to know the communities, being genuine. How would you like to add to these ethical processes?
Yeah, I think it comes down to when proceeding with, let's just say, a research project. Let's say someone wants to work in an old growth forest, try to understand the carbon dynamics or biodiversity, and I guess what the role is of certain species is, I think it's important to really take a step back on a broader picture, because I think, again, this comes down to the goals. What's the goal of being somewhere, and what are your questions? And I think the stepping back is, where is it specifically, thinking locally and thinking about the community that's there, whose land you're on. I think it's important to ask yourself that question, and not only that, I think broaden the questions that any researcher would go into in that case. And so not only, let's think about the carbon and maybe the fungal communities in the soil and what they do for, let's say, carbon dynamics of that ecosystem. Well, I think there's a broader perspective there in thinking about, relationality and relating, and how the communities relate to the land and these different aspects of the place. And so I think that taking that really broader holistic approach and having different perspectives on that, I think is one way to facilitate that. Another way, just on the scholarship aspect, the ethical scholarship, as I mentioned, that we're having these issues of non-Indigenous communities speaking on behalf of Indigenous communities, or extracting resources, data, or samples, right? And of course, I think in some cases, they're really famous cases or big cases. And so I think those have probably likely been resolved, and how do we not repeat history on this, right? But other ways in terms of just scholarship and producing publications, peer-reviewed publications. Are you involving members of that Indigenous community or communities of color to the table as either co-authors? Are they reviewing those manuscripts before they get published or accepted for publication? So this is a real problem we're seeing now. Of course, we are seeing it, Indigenous scholars being overwhelmed and with these kinds of asks for, what do we do about this? How do we solve this issue? There is no simple solution to that either. I think it will take time, but I think really it takes everyone just to take that step back. As I said, whose land are we on? What community is there? Are we engaging in that community? Are they consulting, or are we consulting them about the outcomes of the research? What does it mean for them? Not only just for the purpose of an environmental process, and are they involved in the writing or scholarship in peer review?
Thank you so much, Dr. Ignace. And next, I'm going to ask Dr. Neyman, how can we facilitate better, more ethical practices in your area of interest?
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, well, I just want to begin perhaps by strongly from the other side, echoing the comments that Danielle just made about trust and patience and relationship building and taking time and taking, like from my perspective as a settler scholar, taking the back seat in those processes and allowing them to be guided by the priorities of the communities whose land I'm working on. And I think, we can extend that also, like that sort of idea about building relationship also brings me to echo a bit what Max said about finding those spaces where we can actually have conversations across difference. And that difference is not always antagonistic, but it might just be cultural difference and different experiences and different, ways of understanding the world. So some of my work is actually about building what we call like social infrastructures, right? Instead of climate change mitigation infrastructures that are dams or solar arrays, we're actually building social infrastructures to have those spaces of exchange and learning and trying to build trust, which isn't always possible, but we can try. I also think I want to take a moment to say that I think creating more ethical scholarship is also about looking in our own homes or our own research labs, right? Like how we treat our students, how we treat our admin staff, what kinds of research environments do we create, and are they welcoming and actually celebrating scholars who are parents or caregivers or come from marginalized or low socioeconomic backgrounds, disabled students? Are we creating the actual spaces where they can thrive and contribute their wealths of knowledges? So like that's also really important ethical scholarship for me, is building the or fostering the sort of research environments for doing scholarship ethically, which also I think pings on what others have been saying. And then finally I would just say like not treating climate change as a foregone conclusion or the planet as already dead. I think it's unethical to give up. I'm going to quote my colleague and friend Rita Wong, who says, the oceans aren't giving up and the forests aren't giving up. And like, who are we to give up? So it's like a real ethical necessity to still hold on to the possibility for building different kinds of worlds.
Thank you so much, Dr. Niminus. I love that. Don't give up, because the earth hasn't given up on us. And next, I'd like to move on to Dr. Dan Weary. How can we facilitate better, more ethical practices in your area of interest?
Thanks. Yeah, well, for fear of resonating with the rest of the panel, one of the issues I think I'd like to return to is this idea of democratizing the inputs that we consider. That we live in academia in a very sort of expert-centric world, and of course there is an important role for expert voices. When we do research on developing better AI interfaces for the early detection of disease, this is an area where obviously there's primacy of expert voices. But many of the big ethical issues really do require an understanding of a diversity of voices. And in fact, just even taking the time and effort to carefully consider how different parties are impacted by decisions and giving weight to the interests of those various parties. And this is the very basis of where we need to begin. One of the challenges I think in doing that is that it means that also we have to create this room to have this understanding of the variety of participants. And sometimes, and actually even here at the university, we have serious barriers to the transparency to making information known that needs to be known in order for people to be able to make good decisions about how to act. And I think that's one role that we can all take, is in trying to create an open forum. And indeed, one of the sort of key roles for what academics should be doing is creating these open areas for discussion. I guess one of the sort of hopeful thing that I'd like to end on here, though, is to say that I think for me, one of the great pleasures of being at a university, of course, is being surrounded by all these bright young minds. And being at this university here on the wacky West Coast is we're surrounded by individuals that have actually a long-standing interest, for example, in my area of this interest of what matters to animals and how do we create better worlds for animals. And that's very exciting. It's this huge army of potential scholars who can join us in solving these problems and making sure that we don't. I love that quote that the straight to leftist with was, so yeah, this idea that we mustn't accept defeat, and I don't think we need to, because we're surrounded by this amazing opportunity of these young minds that can take these areas of scholarship forward.
Thank you, Dr. Weary. And finally, I'd like to ask Dr. Cameron.
Thanks. I'm going to pick up on some of the things that have been said, and I'm sorry, Viorica, I'm taking back a little bit of the optimism of my previous comments, because as somebody who works on democratic theory, I believe passionately in the possibility of democracy and in citizenship and building the most inclusive and universalistic citizenship possible. But citizenship also always implies both inclusion and exclusion. And there's always something left out, whether it's future generations. How well do our democracies allow us to care for future generations? How well do they allow us to care for nature, for animals? Children. Think about climate change, but also think in terms of what about the citizens who would prefer not to be citizens, who would prefer exodus or self-determination or some other form of governance. What about people who are afflicted by displacement and violence? And can't exercise rights of citizenship. So our citizenship regimes are deeply problematic. And I think one of the big challenges that we face in the context of democratic theory is to think about these problems and to try to address them. And there are several things that I do think we can do. For example, there's very interesting work. Astrida talked about living together well, and that's a kind of there's a Latin American indigenous Quechua and Aymara idea of sort of living well in harmony with nature. Are there ways of thinking about giving legal standing through our constitutions and our statutes to nature, to animals, non-human animals, to ecosystems? So there are possibilities of legal reform, legal changes. There are institutional reforms. We've been so tepid in terms of experimenting with more participatory innovations in Canada in recent years. France recently had a citizens' assembly on climate change. What happens when you get a group of citizens together and task them with coming up with the best possible responses to climate change based on exposure to a wide range of views and expert advice and the opportunity to reflect deeply on the issue, you get something very different from what our current legislatures provide us. And then finally, social movements. I think they're absolutely critical. Our systems don't change without extraordinary pressure from outside. And it's striking in this province, the incredible disconnect, but not only in this province, but certainly the disconnect between what climate activists are doing, what forest defenders and land defenders are doing, and our public institutions, our parliamentary institutions. There's an extraordinary disconnect there. And I think that we need to build bridges to bring some of that public pressure to bear on our politics. So I'm on the one hand, I think citizenship is terribly important, but I think that there are a host of important deficits that an ethically informed research agenda has to come to terms with.
Thank you, Dr. Cameron, and very fair. Much like we should be hopeful for the future, we should also be aware of what the reality is, because it's really not fair to the people who suffer the most from these inequalities if we just overlook those as well. So we have time for one question, I think, from the audience, and then we're going to do a last prompt. And so I have a question here. As young people, and I'd also like to say thank you so much to our panelists for sharing your insights with us. So this is going to be a question for all the panelists, to clarify. So as young people, maybe not just young, maybe just anyone, how do we turn feelings of grief and eco-anxiety in the face of the climate crisis into feelings of empowerment, mobilization, and action? Feel free to step in, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you, Dr. Leary.
I'll jump in. I can't help it because, like, to a mass, man, I love our motto. And so, yes, this is about, it's up to you. So if you're part of UBC, Team UBC, man, go do something. And there's tons of stuff to be doing. Of course, as academics, I mean, all of us would welcome, if you have passionate ideas, come knock on our doors and join our research groups. That's contributing from the academic side. As Danielle mentioned, academic work is often slow and works to sort of an odd time agenda, but it's what we know how to do. But of course, the UBC is also broadly connected to the outside communities too, and can connect you in with civil society more broadly.
Wow, thank you. Dr. Neyman?
Yeah, this is such an important question. And I don't want to downplay how significant grief and anxiety and real trauma is in the lives of my own kids I see around me, my students. I've actually changed my whole course in teaching on environment to be about pleasure and joy, like, as not the opposite of these things, but how we can find these things in the face of everything. But I actually want, in a sort of direct response, I'm going to just put it in the chat here, shout out a book by my friend and colleague Blanche Verley, Learning to Live with Climate Change, where she did research in the context of some young people she worked with. And what she concludes there is grief is, as we know, like, it's disorienting, it shifts us, trauma like reorganizes who we understand ourselves to be. And what she says is, what if we took that sort of rupture as an opportunity to become different, collectively, and in a way that, could, and again, I don't want to minimize the fact that there are really tragic consequences sometimes, but it can also perhaps be an opportunity to mobilize collectively around these issues and find community, find ways of changing things that we didn't want to sustain anyways. There's lots about sustainability that like we actually want to leave behind, right? Some of the ways that we do society. So it's about how do you actually not downplay the grief, but use it as an opportunity to perhaps find different kinds of collective and communal ways of moving forward differently.
Thank you, Dr. Neyman. And for the interest of time, I would just like to wrap up with one final prompt. And if the panelists could please answer the question, maybe it'll be a quick fire. If you could just give one sentence. Actually, Dr. Niminus, you kind of answered it already, which was if you could share one resource with us, such as a book, article, or podcast, what would it be? So if there's another resource you would like to recommend,
sure. I'll say for sure Blanche's book because it's relevant to the conversation, but one that I know has really changed the thinking of a lot of my colleagues and myself is Max Le Boiron's new book, Pollution is Colonialism. It's comes highly recommended, and it's very readable, even for people who are not, high-level academics.
Great, thank you.
I'll put it in the chat.
Yes, please do. And next, one sentence, a resource, Dr. Dan Weary.
I'll put you back off mute. Yeah, okay. I just type it into the chat as well. It'd be actually very grounded. I've got this is a UBC website on the use of animals in research here on campus. And yeah, I think it's just as interesting for us as members of the community just to realize the number of animals that are used in research. I encourage people to think about it themselves and to engage with their neighbors and family and friends on this issue. It's just one of the ethical issues that of course are important that we begin to deal with as a collective society. And these are our animals, and roughly 3 or 4 animals per every undergraduate here at the university are used every year.
Thank you. And Dr. Cameron?
Well, I would say read Aristotle's Ethics, but that's a heavy lift. And so if you're not up for that, this book, Practical Wisdom, The Right Way to Do the Right Thing by my dear friend Ken Sharp and Barry Schwartz, is a fabulous primer on all of the stuff that I've been talking about today.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Ignace?
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to reiterate the point on that was made a couple of minutes ago about how do we, answering that question, how we deal with feelings of grief and anxiety. And for myself, having dealt with that in the past year of trauma, right? Trauma in lots of different ways for Indigenous communities. Finding community was really super important to me, and just having those conversations. I know it's hard, right? It's hard to even do this over Zoom, but if you can go for a walk with someone and talk about it, especially if they have these shared traumas, I think that's so important to work it out and think of ways to move forward, and therefore be an advocate and a leader to help, not repeat history, right? And that pivots to some people who are really important to me in the past year for that, and in relating to your question about resources. And I'll just give a shout out to these fellow colleagues who are new Indigenous colleagues that I've really bonded with this year in relating to all of these topics and thinking about how all these difficult questions, and Shandine Pete and Andrea Reed and Tabitha Martins. And it's just been a really important year to work out some of these thoughts and issues and trauma and anxiety as a cohort of Indigenous scholars. But also I would encourage everyone, we are all writing about these types of issues. And so I would encourage checking out their names and their publications and even podcasts and webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to post all the recommended resources on the Neuroethics Canada website. Before we move to the behind the scenes breakout sessions, I would first like to thank Dr. Leslie Cormack for her opening remarks, our distinguished panelists, of course, and you, our audience members, for attending. This marks the final session of the Ethics for UBC series. A sincere thank you to all of you who have attended the events of this series. You're also going to receive a very brief follow-up survey to further the goals of ethics at UBC.